Good afternoon. My name is Peggy Mason. I'm a member of the Group of 78 Board of Directors and the president of the Rideau Institute on International Affairs. On behalf of the three sponsors of this event, the Group of 78, G20 Interfaith Forum, and the International Academy of Multicultural Cooperation, welcome everyone. It is my great pleasure to host this most timely seminar on how the nuclear threat posed by the Ukraine-Russia conflict can be minimized or ideally eliminated altogether through determined and enlightened diplomacy. Diplomacy, as everyone will know, has not been a major focus of international engagement on the Ukraine conflict since Russia's full-scale invasion in February of 2022, despite efforts from many sides, including the organizations represented here today. That all changed yesterday when US President Trump announced he had spoken to President Putin for more than an hour, and further that the two countries would begin negotiations to try to end the Ukraine war. No mention of the role of Ukraine or Europe. So even more to talk about than when this seminar was first planned. I am delighted, therefore, that we have two such experienced and knowledgeable speakers to lead our discussion. Paul Meyer is a former career diplomat, including a stint as Canada's ambassador for disarmament to the UN. Since retiring from the Foreign Service, he has been a professor of international studies at Simon Fraser University, international security studies, and an active member of several civil society organizations, including a founding fellow of the Outer Space Institute and a past chair and current board member of the Canadian Pugwash group. Dr. Walter Dorn is a professor of defense studies at both the Royal Military College of Canada and the Canadian Forces College. He is Canada's leading expert on UN peacekeeping, and like Paul, an active member of several civil society organizations, including the Canadian Pugwash group. Participants may also be aware of an incisive op-ed he wrote in June of 2024, outlining a possible negotiating strategy for a peace settlement of the Ukraine conflict. A brief word about our format: a 10-minute presentation by each speaker, followed by 10 minutes of follow-up questions and discussion between myself and the speakers. We will then turn to audience questions for 20 minutes, followed by short 2-minute conclusions from each of the panelists and a final comment from me. And now, with no further ado, I turn first to Paul Meyer and then to Walter. Paul.
Yes, well, thanks very much, Peggy, and greetings, Walter. Now, we're meeting today close to the third-year anniversary of the start of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. The level of destruction and loss of life have been enormous. Political voices and polling results alike are increasingly calling for a negotiated settlement to end the conflict. In thinking about the diplomacy that could be applied to obtain a cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, the concept of ripeness can be useful. According to this view, conflicts can reach a point where they are ripe for resolution. A condition that is often linked to this ripeness is when both belligerents are in a situation that is referred to as one of mutually painful stalemate. That is, when neither party can prevail over their opponent by military means, and both parties are experiencing great harm by continuation of the fighting. Alongside the immediate crisis of the war in Ukraine, we must acknowledge that the disruption to the international order caused by Russia's aggression against Ukraine is profound. In three ways, Russia has delivered a severe and enduring blow to the rules-based international order. First, there's the violation of a core obligation of the UN Charter, the use of force against a sovereign state, threatening both its territorial integrity and political independence. Second, Russia has abused its veto privilege as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council to stymie any action against it by the body responsible for maintaining international peace and security under the UN Charter. This, in turn, exposing a key structural weakness of the UN-centered system created in 1945 and contributing to a further erosion of the Council's legitimacy. Third, Russian action in another dimension also has had a major negative impact on global peace and security. That has been President Putin's cynical and irresponsible nuclear saber rattling, raising the specter of employing nuclear weapons in order to destabilize and deter his adversaries. We often hear that the so-called nuclear taboo has prevented the use of nuclear weapons since the atomic bombing of Japan 80 years ago. But Putin's words and deeds point to the use of nuclear weapons as tools of coercion and intimidation. These weapons of mass destruction do not have to be detonated to have a chilling effect on international relations. The termination of existing arms control agreements and the failure for Russia and the United States, which these rival powers still account for almost 90% of the world's nuclear arsenals, the failure to engage in negotiations to conclude a follow-on accord to the 2010 New START agreement, which itself is due to expire in February of next year, suggests a very perilous nuclear future for the planet. With the expiry of New START, there will be no legally binding restraint on the nuclear forces of Russia and the United States. And this at a time when an American president has again embraced the dangerous illusion of a nationwide nuclear missile shield, and thus incentivizing Russia and China, maybe others, to build up their offensive nuclear arsenals even further to overwhelm such putative defenses. Against this somber backdrop, what are the options for diplomatic action? They say that diplomats necessarily have to be professional optimists because the alternative is perpetual war. No one wants to live in a Hobbesian world where life is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutal, and short. As I noted earlier, the situation of the mutually painful stalemate that currently characterizes the military realities in Ukraine may provide the political momentum needed to negotiate a settlement. Ukraine may have to forgo, at least temporarily, the recuperation of its sovereign territory occupied by Russia. Russia, in turn, may have to drop its efforts to effect regime change in Kyiv by force of arms. An armistice rather than a peace treaty along the existing line of control would be the probable near-term goal. Such situations are not uncommon in several regions of geopolitical conflict. Think of the Korean Peninsula or India's frontiers with both Pakistan and China. The involvement of third parties is likely to be a feature of an eventual settlement for Ukraine, most prominently in the provision of security guarantees for Ukraine, backed up with a tangible military presence on the ground sufficient to deter any resumption by Russia of its invasion. This will be a tall order for Ukraine's partners in the current circumstances. President Zelensky has mused about the need for 200,000 troops, but even more restrained estimates by experts figure in the 50 to 100,000 range, which could well prove unfeasible for Ukraine's European and North American friends, especially given the huge question mark hanging over what role, if any, the US would play. As of yesterday, the pernicious nature of that role has become more apparent. As one Canadian analyst, Wesley Work, has just commented today, quote, a sellout of historic proportions is in the offing. End of citation. With Putin remaining in charge in the Kremlin and his bromance with Donald Trump intensifying, Ukraine and its partners will need to be wary of any eventual settlement terms that do not provide for prompt and effective enforcement in the case of violations. Although the situation on the battlefield may make this a propitious time to launch a diplomatic initiative, there remains the question of who will launch it and assume the weighty if critical role of mediator. Although both parties had engaged in direct negotiations early in the conflict, nearly 3 years of cruel fighting and widespread abuses of international humanitarian and human rights law probably preclude direct talks. Ukraine and its supporters cannot afford to be excluded from the negotiating table. A period of so-called proximity talks may be the most practical at this stage, with perhaps the UN Secretary General or a representative assuming that mediating role. The ICRC could also perform this function. Another variant would involve a prominent political leader from a state enjoying good tides with both belligerents, Turkey or India, perhaps. Whomever the mediator will be, it will be necessary to get the effort underway shortly in order that the belligerents can have a viable process to turn to instead of grinding on with the current fighting. Only with a ceasefire in Ukraine will we be able to start mending the rip in the international fabric created by this cruel and senseless war. Thank you.
A lot there to chew on. I'm going to turn immediately now to Walter.
Well, Paul, with your very distinguished history in careers in foreign ministry and on disarmament, I usually like to start off conversations about the nuclear threat with some quantitative analysis of the nuclear threat using data. In 1961, the Novaya Zemlya test committed by the Soviet Union, it had an explosive yield of 50 megatons of TNT. And that might just be a number, but consider this: the entire explosive yield of all the weapons used in World War II, including in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was less than 5 megatons. So in one nuclear test held in the atmosphere, for which we still have the radioactive particles still in the atmosphere, there was a 10 times more explosive factor than in all of the World War II. So that's just gives you a sense of what the power of nuclear weapons. And since we're talking about threat, the threat is like risk. It's, you can put this in an equation. It's probability times impact. And we know that the impact is huge, so that's going to weigh in heavily on the risk. Fortunately, during the Cold War, the nations decided that they would try and have means by which they could not enter into direct conflict, which could escalate into nuclear conflict. And they learned that very early on in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Before that, Khrushchev had boasted that the Soviet Union was producing ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, off of the assembly plants like sausages. Then, with the rude awakening of the Cuban Missile Crisis and having nightmares of nuclear war, a new mode of thinking came in there that, as summarized by Gorbachev and Reagan later on in a very convenient phrase, nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. So the prudence of the Cold War was to keep the major powers away from each other so that small conflicts couldn't escalate into something bigger, so that miscalculation would be less likely to result in nuclear war. And I think we can really learn from the prudence of the Cold War. And what we see is that in the case of Vladimir Putin, he was very careful in his words and actions on nuclear weapons until the Ukraine war. Then he began some nuclear saber rattling in 2024. It may have faded from the headlines, but it's still extremely important for us to be aware of this. So I'm very grateful the sponsors for doing this session, because we really do need to be aware of that danger which still exists. For instance, in March of 2024, Putin said that Moscow is ready to use nuclear weapons in case of a threat to the existence of the Russian state, our sovereignty, and independence. So that's a very broad, their sovereignty, which they conclude territorial integrity or other means. Then in September of last year, he said that he was updating Russia's nuclear doctrine, expanding nuclear weapons use conditions to include retaliation against conventional attacks that threaten Russia or Belarus's sovereignty or territorial integrity. Now, you may recall that just before that, in August, Ukraine had invaded Kursk region of Russia. So the condition was actually met, meaning that in Putin's mind, or at least in this announcement, that the condition would now allowed Russia to use nuclear weapons. Very scary. Then in October, they did exercises of nuclear forces, simulating strikes, firing ICBMs, tests on ICBMs. And you might recall that in 2023, Russia actually deployed nuclear weapons to Belarus and conducted tactical nuclear weapons drills. This was the first time that nuclear weapons were sent by Russia outside of Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And then in November of last year, Putin formally lowered the threshold for nuclear weapons use even further, allowing potential nuclear response even to a conventional attack on Russia by any nation supported by nuclear power, by a nuclear power. So that would be the Ukraine attack on Russia would qualify for that, having been supported by the US, France, and Great Britain. Now, Putin was almost certainly bluffing, but at the same time, when you're dealing with someone who's like Putin, an autocrat who uses power and disregards human security, you have to take these warnings and these indicators with great heed. You shouldn't back down because of it, but at the same time, you got to make sure that you don't do something that would incite or put the Russian government into a corner so that it cannot respond with other means. Now, there's actual real potential for nuclear weapons use, not just because of deliberate action, decision by Putin, but also because of miscalculation or accidental use. In these hot times, there can be very great amounts of tension that cause parties at different levels in the hierarchy to make mistakes. And these weapons are on the ready. We've seen that in the exercise. So even if there's no deliberate use, there's still this great danger of a technical malfunction, a chain of command error, some action of an insane individual within the hierarchy. When technical measures are not working, like the permissive action links or PALs that have been placed by the two major nuclear powers in the past, if somehow something's failing there, like things failed in Chernobyl in 1986, then we have a great danger that an individual also making a rash act could then cause major escalation. Then I'd also add to the threat of catastrophe at a nuclear reactor. Now, fortunately, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is in cold shutdown now as of April of 2024. But there are other nuclear reactors operating in Ukraine which have seen missiles come within 300 meters of the actual reactors. So this is very dangerous. It was just as recent as November and December. And I do think that it's useful that IAEA, international personnel, are there to help be objective international monitors, and that provides us something of a lesson for the future. Now, with the negotiations having been initiated, if not discussions about negotiations, then something that we can say that there's a willingness on both sides to come to the negotiating table. With that, there's probably less likely that there'll be a deliberate action by Putin to use nuclear weapons. Previously, we saw that he was willing to point to some conspiracy theories about WMD and secret US-funded biolabs in Ukraine, but those kind of scenarios are less likely. But the other actor on here is also very unpredictable. Putin now has a political ally in President Trump, but President Trump is is a character that we cannot say with certain won't do rash things. He's certainly given to doing things that under the unexpected. In fact, in the last days of Trump 45, last days of his office previously, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually phoned his counterpart in China to reassure the Chinese military that the U.S. is not planning a war, and that they wanted to avoid any misperception that might have been created by Trump's words. And remember, Trump is the one who said to North Korea that there would be fire and fury like the world has never seen. He said that in 2017. That was hyperbole, of course, but it came before that romance, or shall I call it dictator-mance, between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, ultimately resulting in no treaty or no positive developments, but contributed to so many headlines. And I'm a bit worried that that's what the current exercise in Ukraine is about. So trying to be solutions-oriented and trying to think about the ways we can avoid a nuclear catastrophe. One immediate measure is to end the Ukraine war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, within the next year. And you shouldn't try and reward aggression. So Russia shouldn't be able to gain territory from this. But I do recognize that Ukraine may need to not agree, but to recognize that Russia has control over Ukrainian territory in Donbass, Crimea, even though it's not de jure recognition, not a surrender of territory, but it's rather a factor of the reality of life. And the delay in Ukraine joining NATO would be very welcome, even though since 2008, NATO has said that Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. But I just can't see that Ukraine would join NATO in the near future, because if they did, there could very easily become a war between us and Russia. The escalation could be happening there. There could be some border troops who are firing at each other, and we see an escalation which results into a war, which would be really detrimental for everyone. Now, Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary of the United States, did say yesterday about a peacekeeping force, and he didn't think it should be NATO and not with any U.S. troops. And I think there should be a peacekeeping force, probably from troops from more independent countries and with some officers from NATO serving in staff positions, but the troops themselves forming a buffer zone should be not from NATO. Otherwise, if we don't come to a peace agreement, then Zelensky's, let's going to call it a threat or is a reality for Ukraine. He said if Ukraine does not join NATO, they may need to pursue nuclear weapons. So these talks are really important, not only for ending the war between Russia and Ukraine, but also for preventing the end of the world as we know it. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very, very much. A lot of very important issues to discuss. Going back to Paul, and actually both Paul and Walter, you have talked about, Paul used the term armistice along the line of control, not a peace treaty. And Walter, you, as you did in your New York Times op-ed, talked about Ukraine, a peace deal where Ukraine recognizes de facto Russian control over the territory that it occupies now, without, ceding legal jurisdiction, without ceding sovereignty. The question I have for both of you is, had we started that negotiation, your article was in the summer of 2024, I think, Walter, had we started, had the international community taken up a negotiation in earnest, convinced Ukraine that now is the time to negotiate, perhaps we could be discussing things in this manner. But now we've got a president who's gone over the heads of everybody else. He's negotiating directly with Putin, and he isn't negotiating an armistice. He's negotiating a peace agreement whereby Russia gets the land that it has occupied, that it is occupying. And he's left the question of security guarantees so important to Ukraine. He says, oh, that's a European issue, not an issue for us to consider. So, so where does that leave us? So I look at you, Paul, first. What can and of course Europe is being left out of the negotiation as well. So at this stage, as you know, what do diplomats do? You're advising European diplomats. What do they do at this point?
Yeah, well, I think they have to speak up first and foremost and say it's absolutely unacceptable to have Ukraine as the sort of the object of some kind of backroom deal between the likes of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. I think it is an important distinction, as Walter mentioned, you know, between acknowledging de facto control and ceding de jure sovereignty. And I don't think Ukraine will do the latter. And, you know, it may be a long stretch, but I'm old enough to recall that the three Baltic states, which are now, of course, NATO members and have been, you know, independent since 1991, they were independent in the immediate aftermath of the First World War and the Versailles Treaty that recognized their independence. But they fell foul of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and the Soviet Union took them over and formally annexed them to the Soviet Union. But the West, including notably the United States, but Canada and many others, never recognized that annexation. You may recall the reference was to the captive Baltic states. And I think that was an important, you know, political signal that that annexation was illicit, illegal, full of violent excesses, and that it was not going to be accepted. And eventually, fortunately, the dynamics change, you know, but we are talking about 50 years, you know, later. So that is, I know, a long gain, a long-term perspective, but I think Ukraine is fully on its rights to say it will never accept that annexation. And I would hope that Ukraine supporters will back them up on that, and in their own positions, you know, reflect that this is not going to be ceding sovereignty. And it's even more, of course, as I tried to get in my comments, more than just the situation in Ukraine. It is the integrity and viability of a core norm of international relations since the end of the Second World War, which was borders will not be altered by force. There should be no acceptance of that tactic. So we don't want in future this to be seen as an inoperable norm or one that will not be backed up at a time of trouble. And, you know, I don't have to extend, you know, the other pundits have spoken about, you know, this would give China carte blanche to take over Taiwan, or for, you know, Kremlin to once again try to bring the Baltic states or Moldova or others into its sphere of influence. So besides the immediate problem of the Ukraine war, I think there's a fundamental danger to the whole rules-based international order here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Before turning to Paul, I'm going to push a little bit because the I think in your introduction, you talked about a stalemate, and I think with great respect, the weight of opinion assessing the military situation is that it isn't a stalemate, that Russia is slowly you know, taking more territory. And so the real damage I would argue the real damage to the international order is if Russia succeeds in winning the war. A negotiated settlement, a freely negotiated settlement, is not a breach of the of that cardinal rule of taking territory by force, even if that's what started the process. But I guess what I want to get at, and I'll turn to you, Walter, what I want to get at is the other problem with a frozen conflict is the real hope for Ukraine is EU membership. And a frozen conflict, unsettled borders, will make it extraordinarily difficult for Ukraine to become a member of the EU. So that gives Ukraine a real incentive to try and negotiate a settlement, a real settlement. And and there are, there are some bargaining chips. A big bargaining chip is sanctions relief, and the European Union can play a big role there. So I just wonder if you have some comments on that.
Yes, Peggy, EU will be a major player, and I think we should say there should be no Ukraine deals without Ukraine, and that the EU should have a seat at the table, that they should be part of the process and probably signatories to the eventual agreement. The EU has a huge interest in the stability of Ukraine, and it wants Ukraine to be a member. And so it has an action plan for that to occur. And I think it would be good for Ukraine and the stability of the world if Ukraine actually became a member of the EU. I think that unstable borders might be unsettling, but it's still possible to join the EU with unstable borders. It's not possible to join NATO with unsettled borders, because in that case, it could very easily result in a much wider war. But it could do the economic links and the reconstruction, although difficult, but still it could, the non-occupied area of Ukraine could be experience a strong component of reconstruction under the EU. And I think it's important that Ukraine be strong on the battlefield, that Russia's current slight momentum does not give Russia a advantage on the negotiating table. So I'd like to see Ukraine strong on the battlefield so it can be stronger at the negotiating table. And what I do see, to answer the last part of your question, is that there will be ceasefires in the near future, probably this year, and that they may start and stop. They come in fits and starts, and then both sides will accuse each other of violating the ceasefire. But that's would be important. You're starting to test the dependability, reliability of the other side. And out of the ceasefire, we could get something more like a signed armistice. There could be a buffer zone established, a peacekeeping force. But there's also a necessity for something greater than that, and that's a peace agreement. And Russia and Ukraine will need to be neighbors for centuries to come. And they've got to realize that they've got to come up with an agreement that can keep themselves at peace. And I think it's much better for Ukraine to be in a peace agreement, even if it's unstable, and even though there might be breakout from Putin, that peace agreement would allow Ukraine to rebuild, including its military. So it may be that part of Ukraine is still occupied, and you might need to wait until a Gorbachev comes or some Russian leader who's willing to give up some of what Russia has claimed through conquest. But I think enlightened self-interest from Russia will realize that in order to reintegrate into Europe and the world, that it needs to abide by those very important principles that Paul has enunciated, that aggression and conquest shall not be rewarded.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. We've got more time before we go to the, no, we don't. We are due now, and I thank you both for those fulsome answers. I see now by my calculation that we should be going to the audience questions. And so I suggest that we do that. I see the first question is from Robin Collins, a member of the board of the Rideau Institute, and he says, in the minds of many, if Eastern Ukraine is granted to Putin, there remains a question as to whether Putin has ambitions beyond Eastern Ukraine, and in particular, Moldova, and Georgia. How might security guarantees for Ukraine within a peace deal help or hinder this threat? Well, I might just add that one of the follow-up questions I didn't get a chance to ask of the two of you, of our two speakers, was about security guarantees, because Trump may think they're not important, but I think it's safe to say that everyone else, all the Europeans and Ukraine and most commentators believe that they're fundamentally important. So, I'd be very interested. Let's turn first to Paul, and on the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine within a peace deal. How might they work? We've got this further problem of the fact that they somehow have to work outside the UN Security Council, because of course both US and Russia have vetoes there, and therefore it wouldn't be very good to have a security guarantee that Russia could veto just when you needed it. So it is a question in the past. I think the thinking had been it would be a NATO guarantee, but that requires US acquiescence. So I'll turn first Paul and then back to Walter.
On Robin's question, I note that I think history suggests that feeding the territorial ambitions of a dictator has usually not sated their appetite, but just increased it. Moldova and Georgia are distinct cases, and I think they ultimately will have to be approached separately from whatever emerges as a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. I do believe that the security guarantees would have to be tangible and solid. And already, as you know, that Peggy can't be subject to UN Security Council given the vetoes there. The U.S. Defense Secretary has already made it clear that it can't be NATO either. This operation would be outside, and it then becomes incumbent on those allies of Ukraine, I think individually and collectively, to deploy forces there. I have a slight disagreement with Walter in terms of I see no basis for excluding NATO member states in future force on the ground, whether that is buffer zone role or something other. I think there's no reason why a sovereign state cannot, in a sense, agree to have on its territory forces from other states, status of forces agreements, etc. And when we look at the non-European, if we're thinking of the traditional troop contributing nations to UN peacekeeping, I'm not sure that President Zelensky would be reassured if there's going to be contingents from Bangladesh and Burundi and Ethiopia that would be there on the ground. I think he will be looking for a strongest military capacity, as is politically and militarily feasible for him, because he will want to feel he can credibly deter Russia from resuming its invasion at a future time.
Peggy, you're on mute. I guess I'll just continue then. So I don't think that Putin has this desire to go much further because he's burnt himself so much in Ukraine. It's been such a lesson for him that it's not easy to invade another country. Moldova is very far away, even though there are some Russian forces stationed there, but it'd be extremely difficult to do an aggressive act in Moldova. Georgia, easier, but it's just the world is now so suspicious of Putin that I think he'd see some sanctions come back if he would take any kind of military maneuvers on Moldova, Georgia, or other places. So I think that there's not that much danger. Ukraine is obviously very dear to him, and dear to him in his ambitions. And so he would love to be able to acquire more of Ukraine, but he'll have a hard time just managing the territories that he has with a lot of resistance forces against the occupiers. What can the rest of the world do? Well, they can certainly help provide arms and training. I mean, I'm at an institution where I am teaching to Ukrainian officers, and we could definitely increase that. There could be bilateral agreements between countries to deploy some forces in there, but I think we have to be very careful that NATO not deploy a force, because Russia would see that as direct expansion. And if NATO were involved, it would be like a red flag in front of a bull, and the Russians would just find ways to go across the border and buffer zone and attack NATO forces and express the anger, which could very easily escalate. So it would be extremely dangerous to have NATO as an organization deploy forces there. There can be some NATO nations who have some officers serving in a peacekeeping force and as a staff position, but I do think it has to be led by someone from a more neutral or a non-aligned country, like say Brazil, or India, or some other countries, which would have some respect from Russia because of their position more generally. And we need to have some capable forces among them too. But the very presence of a buffer zone would make it more difficult for Russia to stage attacks across into the Ukrainian government territory.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Am I unmuted now? Okay, great. Thank you. Walter, you didn't say it specifically, but I'm assuming that you are talking about a UN authorized peacekeeping force. Yes, because that would be, I think, very, very important to have.
Yes, and it's possible because Russia, if it's part of the peace deal, would not veto it in the Security Council.
Exactly, exactly. But I just want, coming back to the question from Robin and the discussion of security guarantees, I just want to note, I mean, the peacekeeping force, to ensure there is implementation of the peace agreement is a separate issue, I would argue, from the security guarantees writ large. I mean, Ukraine has made it very clear that it's no good reaching what might be an agreement that they can agree to, and then have a peacekeeping force that will make sure it's implemented. And then down the road, in 5 years or 10 years, when there aren't any, peacekeeping forces there, then Russia changes its mind and decides it's going to, it's going to re-invade. So that's where this knotty problem of having a different kind of, having a security guarantee, which essentially means countries will respond. They are officially agreeing that they will respond if this happens. Normally, I mean, one way of doing that, it was the Budapest Memorandum, was it would go to the Security Council for consultation. Well, we know that's not going to work. So if you have any thoughts on, I guess my point is, it may be difficult, but I think it's a very important area to consider what kind of, and again, for Europe in particular, Trump has thrown it in their lap. Okay, Europe, it's your problem, security guarantees. What are you going to do? Any advice, Walter?
Yes. So I think there could be European countries involved, some European countries who are not members of NATO, because NATO is the red flag for Russia. So you can select from among European members, and they actually have some armed forces there. I think that the peacekeeping force could be mandated to use force when there's attacks from either side. So it could be a more robust force. Obviously, it's not going to withstand a full assault aggression, but it could, like some peacekeeping forces have done, they will respond if there's incursions into the buffer zones. For instance, during an Israeli invasion into Lebanon, the Nepalis held a bridge for 3 days and didn't allow the Israelis to go across that bridge, despite using bulldozers and other things the Israelis were trying to push out the Nepalis. But that was just making the resistance bigger. And I do see that the peacekeeping force could be involved in that level of force and could actually be used to combat when they are threatened, or even civilians are threatened. It could be a protection of civilians mandate. So I'm a little bit ambivalent about countries like Poland and other NATO countries that are really eager to help Ukraine if they were sending forces there. Perhaps if they were part of a larger structure that and they were more in the staff officer level, and then the majority of the force be EU countries or European countries that are not members of NATO.
Thank you.
If I might on that, I just want to remind everyone that the NATO decision-making is by consensus. So if I interpreted what Hexeth's remarks yesterday meant, was that the U.S. would block any consensus decision to have a NATO operation as part of that security presence. So I think, Walter, that fear in a way is, in light of that American position, if it is confirmed, is not there. It's going to be an individual or a group of European states and Canada, I should say. I mean, maybe our contingent in Latvia should be relocated, to the Donbass. And it's a tricky process of finding that right formula for a military presence. There is, on one hand, the security guarantee facet, but the other is sort of the keeping the peace, the peacekeeping role. And somewhat unfortunately, history in terms of the conflict in eastern Ukraine since 2014 has been we, the international community, in the immediate case through the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, fielded a significant special mission to sort of police the line of control, as it almost was, in eastern Ukraine. And it did succeed in some ways in reducing the level of hostility. But it was really encumbered by its mandate. It wasn't, by the way, an insignificant force. There was like 700 personnel that were involved.
Unarmed.
Unarmed, yes. So they didn't have any kind of mission enforcement role. And what I found frustrating is they produced great, glossy, regular reports on violations, but their mandate prevented them from identifying who was responsible for the violation. So, you got this aggregate figure that there were 2,315 violations in the first quarter of, 2020, but there wasn't, the accountability element. So I think, obviously, we don't want to reproduce that, frankly, rather feckless exercise in supporting whether it's an armistice agreement or cessation of hostilities or peace, whatever adjective you want to apply. I think meaningful and credible enforcement will be a real requirement going forward. And it's going to be a real challenge in the absence of a Security Council sanctioned force or a NATO sanctioned force to provide that to Ukraine.
And I just add one thing, that there could be a monitoring force that deploys very rapidly during a ceasefire. And then, of course, we get something that's greater when you have an armistice or a peace agreement. But there is still value to having international observers there, just as like there are IEA inspectors, just like the UN had inspectors in Istanbul to oversee the agreement over the Black Sea Grain Initiative.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for that. There are a number of questions lined up here. And I think I'm going to go with one that hasn't been part of our discussion to this point, and that is from Scott Burbage. Does the Russian Federation have legitimate regional security interests, internationally recognized, that must be taken into account in achieving a durable peace settlement of the Ukraine conflict? And whichever one of you wants to go first on that, you can raise your hand. And I think, well, yeah, I think you were a little bit ahead.
I just would say, of course, all states, have legitimate security interests. It's a case of how you carry them out. And I think whatever interests Russia has in that domain, it didn't give it the right to engage in an aggressive invasion of its neighbor. So we need to have those limits. The basic fact is, despite all the propaganda of the Kremlin, is Russia invaded Ukraine. Neither Ukraine nor NATO invaded Russia. And that, I think, it clarifies, where we need to perceive legitimacy in terms of security going forward.
And as much as I despise Putin's actions, I do think we need to realize that nations are allowed to define their security interests in their own way. We can't sort of say, oh, we're the West and we're defining your security interests. So we have to be a little bit humble about that. And we have to recognize that there's some small percentage that Russia has a right and is truthfully seeing security threats to itself. And the treatment of the Russian-speaking population in eastern Ukraine and other issues like that, there were mistakes made by the Ukrainian government from 2014 onwards. And I think that if we just see this entirely black and white, not 95% black and 5% white, then we miss out on some key elements. And if the world doesn't show any sensitivity, any diplomacy or tact with Russia, then it makes the world worse for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you both. We've reached the point now where we're coming to concluding statements. And so I just thought I might include, in case you wanted to respond in your closing statements to a couple of the questions that I didn't get to. And one of them is from Richard Harmiston. Apart from a peace deal for Ukraine, what measures can the EU, Canada, and others take to de-escalate the new level of nuclear brinkmanship by Russia and potentially by the USA? That's a big question, but I think it's a good one for us to have on our minds. And then another one, if peace occurs, how does Ukraine become rebuilt? And one that I think we've been discussing somewhat anyway, should Ukraine be admitted to NATO? So those are some of the questions I didn't get to, and I look forward to 2 minutes from each of you for your final comments. Paul, if you will, first.
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. In terms of what might be done to de-escalate nuclear tensions, I think, as I alluded to, countries speaking up on the necessity for Russia and the US as the two leading nuclear powers to complete what they claim they want to see follow up to the New START arms reductions and their related, commitments that go with that. So that's, I think, one piece of advocacy that could be done now. I have to confess, that I have a degree of foreboding in my awareness that these meetings tomorrow are happening about the fate of Ukraine, etc., European security, are happening in Munich with all the disturbing historical associations connected with that city. I think the Kremlin would like nothing better than to reassume a status of a great power alongside the United States, and having the two of them decide the fate of lesser states. It is suggestive to me of a kind of Yalta summit redux, with Stalin outmaneuvering an enfeebled FDR and a weakened Churchill to lock in the Red Army's gains in Central and Eastern Europe. It was also somewhat darkly humorous, to see the self-appointed master of the deal taking the role of chump once again, being manipulated by Putin, as he was in that infamous 2018 summit meeting between the two of them, where Trump engaged in what I can only describe as a cringeworthy, subservient performance. So Canada and European allies, and indeed, partners from elsewhere, I think of Japan and Korea, etc., should look to mobilizing pretty deep resources of both a diplomatic and a defense capabilities in order to prevent any further devastating tear in that fabric I spoke for of international security and the rules-based order under the UN Charter. And we need to look to creative but determined approaches to preserve that peace. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. Walter.
Well, thank you. I have very insightful words from Paul. I would show a little bit of tension with what he said. I'm somebody who became politically aware during the Cold War, and was saying that we needed to negotiate with the Soviet Union when many hawks were saying, no, you can't trust anyone. You can't trust Gorbachev. You can't trust the Soviet system. It's all bad, better dead than red. And I think that one of the lessons of the Cold War is, yes, do speak to your enemies. If we are going to call Russia an enemy now, then let's speak to them. Let's have some dialogue. And at this point, it's good to have dialogue at all different levels. I mean, part of the sanctions should be isolation of Russia, but as they move towards a negotiated settlement, there should be resumed diplomacy. It should all be at scaled level. And also true for economic sanctions, that as Russia's behavior improves, so could there be some sanctions relief. If we see action of less attacks on Ukrainian cities, or they stop attacking the cities, then there should be some ways that you can use the carrots as well as the sticks. One of the big sticks that the Europeans have is the $300 billion, mostly in Brussels banks, that was held, and that interest is now being used to help fund Ukraine. But that $300 billion shouldn't just be given back on day one of the end of the war, or when there's a ceasefire. It should be very strategically given back in accordance with compliance. So these are what we call compliance mechanisms. Ukraine can be rebuilt with a plan like the Marshall Plan that the United States had. Obviously, it'll be the Europeans, quite ironically, Germany, benefited so much from Marshall Plan, who will be leading the plan to rebuild Ukraine. And I think that in this entire approach, it reminds me of the Cold War, that you don't want to be a hawk, you don't want to be a dove, but you want to be an owl. At times, you see that there's necessity to be hawkish, at other times to be dovish, sometimes using the stick, sometimes using the carrot. But be wise in approaching this, and don't see the world just in black and white.
Thank you very, very much for those concluding comments. The only thing I would add is, with respect to Richard Harmison's question about Canada, I would hope that Canada would fully engage with our European partners on the diplomatic dimension. There's an opportunity there. There are many pitfalls, as Paul and Walter both outlined, but the opportunity is there to engage, and there are levers. Sanctions relief is a very important element of that. So is a legitimate role for Russia in the European security architecture going forward. Not an illegitimate role, but a legitimate role. Those are very important areas for negotiation, and I certainly hope Canada takes that up. Thank you very much, and thank you to our audience for participating, the excellent questions. And